He was 16 years old. He had lied about his age. And the last letter Hubert Cloud ever wrote to his mother in Louisiana began with 2 words. Don't be mad. He never came home. But the letter did. On the night of June 5th, 1944, more than 10,000 American boys sat down somewhere in southern England and tried to write a letter they hoped would never be opened. Some wrote in tents. Some wrote on cots, with a flashlight under the blanket so the sergeant wouldn't see. Some wrote on the hoods of jeeps. Some used the stock of a rifle as a writing desk. They wrote on cheap army paper, in pencil, with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Most of those letters are gone now. Burned, lost at sea, soaked through with seawater, pulled from a uniform pocket on the beach and never claimed. But the ones that survived are the only honest record we have of what those young men actually felt in the last quiet hours before they ran ashore at Normandy. Not the speeches, not the movies, not the carefully edited memoirs written 40 years later. The letters. Tonight, you're going to hear 8 stories. A few of them you may have heard before. Most of them, I promise you have not. In the last week of May 1944, the U.S. Army Postal Service in southern England did something it had never done before. In 7 days, it processed an estimated 17 million pieces of mail. 17 million. To put that in perspective, that was more mail in a single week than the Army Postal Service had handled in the entire fall of 1942. The clerks couldn't keep up. The official mail facilities were overrun by the 3rd day. So the Army did what the Army always did when the system buckled. It improvised. The basement of a hotel in Bournemouth was quietly commandeered. A horse stable in Dorchester was converted overnight into a sorting room. The smell of hay and motor oil mixing with the smell of paper and ink. 3 village post offices in rural Devon were taken over without explanation. The local postmasters were asked to step aside and asked not to ask questions. The clerks who worked those long nights were sworn to secrecy, not just about what was inside the letters, about the volume of letters. Because German intelligence operatives in Lisbon and in Stockholm were tracking Allied mail volume. A sudden, massive surge in outgoing American mail meant one thing: invasion. So the U.S. Army made a decision that would haunt American kitchens and front porches for years afterward. It held the mail back. Mailbags from the first week of June were not released. They were stacked in warehouses, padlocked, and only sent out in small, staggered batches after the invasion had begun, to disguise the surge, to protect the secret. Which is why, on the morning of June 23, 1944, a mother named Anna Mitchell, in a small town in western Pennsylvania, walked out to her mailbox and found a letter from her son. It was postmarked June 4th. It was cheerful. He told her the food was lousy and the rain was constant, and he hoped to be home by the next harvest. She had buried him 5 days earlier. That mailbag, the one her son's letter rode home in, had been padlocked in a warehouse in Bournemouth for 19 days. The Army had made a choice. The mother paid for it. There is something the U.S. Army never quite admitted in any official document about these last letters. Officially, on paper, death letters were discouraged. The Army's position was that they hurt morale, that a soldier preparing to die was a soldier already half defeated. But unofficially, quietly, the chaplains were doing the opposite. Every chaplain attached to a D-Day unit, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, was telling his men the same thing in those last days. Write the letter. Whatever you need to say. Say it now, while you still can. And then there were the censors. Every outgoing letter from an American soldier was read, sometimes by a junior officer, sometimes by a specially assigned censor at the postal facility. Anything that mentioned the unit, the date, the location, the operation was blacked out with a thick black marker before the letter was photographed and sent home. But the censors were trained to look for military information. They missed something else. They missed the codes. A young soldier who wanted to tell his mother that he was about to be deployed could not, of course, write the words "I am about to be deployed." But he could write, "Tell Aunt Margaret I'll write soon." That was the code. There was no Aunt Margaret. There never had been. His mother knew what it meant. A drawing of a small boat in the margin meant amphibious assault. Underlining the date of the letter heavily 3 or 4 times meant, "Open this only if you receive a telegram." These codes were not invented by the soldiers. They were quietly distributed by the American Red Cross in modest pamphlets to wives and mothers and sweethearts in 1943 and 1944. The Red Cross knew what was coming. The Army knew that the Red Cross knew. The censors somehow did not. So when those letters arrived in American kitchens in late June and early July of 1944, letters that on the surface were cheerful, mundane, full of complaints about the food, the mothers and the wives who knew the codes already knew. They sat at the kitchen table. They held the letter, and they waited for the telegram they already knew was coming. That is what we lost when historians turned away from the personal mail of that war. A whole generation of coded grief. Letters that meant one thing on the page and meant something else entirely at the kitchen table. There is a practice from those last few nights in the marshalling areas of southern England that almost no military historian has written about. It was never an order. It was never even a suggestion from above. It was something the men did on their own. The night before transport, you slipped your last letter, unsealed, in a plain envelope under the bunk of the man next to you. No words, no explanation. He understood. If you didn't come back, he would mail it. If he didn't come back, you would mail his. It was a contract written in silence. A pact between 2 boys who were not yet old enough to vote. Inside the 29th Infantry Division alone, the division that took the worst of the killing on Omaha Beach, after-action reports indirectly reference dozens of these letters being mailed by surviving men in the months that followed. Some of them were mailed in July, some in August, some by men who had survived the beach but had been wounded later in the hedgerow fighting, were mailed from hospital beds in England in September. And then there's the most haunting category of all, the letters that outlived 2 soldiers. In a small town in Ohio, in the second week of November 1944, a woman named Margaret Sullivan answered her front door. A thin, exhausted-looking soldier was standing on her porch, holding a letter. The letter was from her son, Tommy. Tommy had been killed on Omaha Beach in the first hour of D-Day. But the soldier on her porch was not the man Tommy had given the letter to. That man, Tommy's bunkmate, a boy from New Jersey named Eddie, had survived D-Day. He had carried Tommy's letter in his pack through Normandy. He had meant to mail it from a field post office in late July. He had been killed by a German sniper in the hedgerows on July 28th. Eddie's bunkmate, in turn, had pulled Tommy's letter from Eddie's pack. He had sworn twice now to make sure it got home. That is why, in November, on a quiet street in Ohio, a 3rd soldier was standing on Margaret Sullivan's porch. He told her he was sorry it had taken so long. He told her Tommy had loved her very much. He told her about Eddie, and then he asked, softly, if she could spare a minute because he wanted to read her the letter himself. He had read it many times by then, in foxholes, in the rain, in the dark. He didn't want her to read it alone. Of all the men who carried the weight of these letters across the English Channel, none carried it more literally than the chaplains. Father Joseph Lacey, a Catholic priest from Hartford, Connecticut, was attached to the 5th Ranger Battalion. He was 42 years old, slightly overweight, and not, by his own admission, in any kind of shape for combat. In the days before D-Day, his men gave him 63 sealed envelopes. He carried them in a small wooden trunk. He stowed the trunk on the landing craft. He went ashore at Omaha in the second wave. The trunk made it. So did Father Lacey. Most of the boys who had given him those envelopes did not. And then there was Rabbi Hugo Schiff. Rabbi Schiff was a German Jew who had fled Europe in 1937. He had become a U.S. Army chaplain in 1943. He was attached to the 4th Infantry Division. He, too, carried 63 letters ashore at Utah Beach. He survived. For the next 3 years, until 1947, Rabbi Schiff personally hand-delivered every one of those letters to Jewish families across the United States. He took trains to Brooklyn, to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to small towns in upstate New York. He sat in living rooms and parlors and on front porches, and he handed the letter to the mother. He stayed for the funeral when there was a funeral. He sat Shiva when he was asked to. He never charged the Army for any of these trips. He paid for the trains himself. When asked, decades later, why he had done it that way, he said only, "The boy gave the letter to me, so I'm the one who has to bring it." And then there's the chaplain whose story almost broke him. Reverend George Russell Barber, a Methodist minister from North Carolina, was attached to the 1st Infantry Division. He carried 41 last letters ashore at Omaha. His landing craft was hit by German artillery before it ever touched the beach. The footlocker went into the surf. The letters were never recovered. 41 boys had given Reverend Barber the most important words they had ever written. And those words, every last one of them, were dissolving in seawater on the floor of the English Channel. Reverend Barber survived the war. He came home to North Carolina in 1945, and then he sat down at his kitchen table and he began to write. He wrote letters to 41 families. In each letter, he reconstructed from memory the conversations he had had with their boy in the days before the invasion. What the boy had said about his mother, what he had wanted his sister to know, what he had been afraid of, what he had been proud of. He could not remember everything. He admitted that in the letters. He apologized for what he could not remember. He wrote 41 of these letters in his first year home. He kept writing them in updated form every Christmas for the next 28 years, until he died in 1973. The Chaplain Corps' unofficial estimate is that more than 4,000 farewell letters were carried into the Normandy invasion in Chaplin's trunks. Roughly 30% of them were lost. 1,200 letters, 1,200 final goodbyes that no mother ever read. Of the 156,000 Allied troops who came ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, approximately 2,000 were African American. Most of them served in segregated units. Transportation battalions, port battalions, graves registration. The Army of the United States in 1944 did not yet allow black men to fight in the front lines. With one exception, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion landed in the first wave at Omaha in Utah. It was the only black combat unit on the beaches that morning. Corporal Waverly Woodson Jr. was 21 years old. He was a medic with the 320th. He had grown up in West Philadelphia. He had wanted to be a doctor. His landing craft was hit twice before it reached the shore. Shrapnel tore into his back and into his groin. He was bleeding heavily before his boots ever touched French sand. He spent the next 30 hours treating other wounded men on Omaha Beach. He performed amputations under fire. He pulled men from the surf. He gave plasma to soldiers whose names he never learned. He did this for 30 hours with his own wounds untreated until he finally collapsed. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. He never received it. No African American soldier received the Medal of Honor for service in World War II until 1997. By then, Waverly Woodson was an old man. He died in 2005, still uncrowned. But Waverly Woodson had written a letter on June 4th, 1944, to his mother in Philadelphia. The letter survives. It is held today at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It is short. It says in part, "Mama, if something happens to me here, please don't be angry at the Army or at this country. I came over to do a job. I want you to know that if something happens, I went down doing the work." 300 American Pathfinders were the first Allied soldiers to set foot in occupied France on D-Day. They jumped from C-47s at 15 minutes past midnight on June 6th, into the dark, into anti-aircraft fire, into wind that scattered them across the Norman countryside. By sunrise, more than half of them were dead. Lieutenant Frank Lillyman was the very first. The first Allied soldier to touch French soil on D-Day. He landed in a hedgerow at 0016 hours, June 6th, 1944. He had a daughter back home in Skaneateles, New York. She was 4 years old. In his footlocker in England, he had left behind a single piece of paper. It was unsealed. The handwriting was rough, like it had been written quickly. It said, "Be good to your mother. I love you very much." That was the entire letter. And then there's the boy we started with. Hubert P. Caloud, a United States Marine, 16 years old, from Omaha, Louisiana. He had told the recruiter he was 18. The recruiter had not looked too closely. It was 1944, and the country needed bodies. Hubert was attached to a unit that would not, technically, see combat at Normandy. The Marines were largely committed to the Pacific Theater. But Hubert was on a transport ship in the Channel that morning, in a support role, when his ship struck a mine. He drowned. His mother received the telegram 3 weeks later. She received the letter 10 days after that. The letter began, "Don't be mad. I know I lied. I know you would have stopped me. But, Mama, every other boy I knew was going. I couldn't be the one who stayed home. I couldn't be the one you had to explain. Don't be mad. Please don't be mad." Across the channel, in a German bunker carved into the cliffs above Omaha Beach, a position the Germans called Widerstandsness 62, a 19-year-old conscript was also writing a last letter that night. His name has not survived. His letter has. It was found, after the war, in the pocket of his uniform by an American Graves registration team. It said, in German, "Mother, the Americans are coming. They are very many. I have not been a brave son. I tried." He was killed by U.S. naval gunfire shortly after sunrise. Fear that morning had no flag. There is a small town in central Virginia called Bedford. In 1944, 3,200 people lived there. It had a courthouse, 2 churches, a movie theater, and a drugstore on the corner of Main and Bridge Street. Inside that drugstore, Green's Drugstore, was the only teletype machine in the county. On the morning of July 17th, 1944, the teletype began to print. It printed, and it printed, and it did not stop. The girl behind the counter was named Elizabeth Tease. She was 21 years old. She had been a teletype operator at Green's for 2 years. She watched the messages come through, one by one. At first, she thought there had been an error in the system. There had not been. 19 of Bedford's young men had been killed on Omaha Beach in the first hour of D-Day. Their next of kin telegrams had been delayed for 6 weeks, while the Army identified the dead and notified the families through proper channels. Now, on a single July morning, all 19 telegrams arrived at the same teletype, in the same drugstore, in the same small Virginia town, addressed to families who all knew each other. Elizabeth Tease was the one who had to call the families and tell them to come to the drugstore. She made the calls one by one all morning. She did not cry until the last call. In the days and weeks that followed, something else began to arrive in Bedford. And not just in Bedford, in every town in America that had lost a son on D-Day. The U.S. Postal Service, between July and December of 1944, returned an estimated 38,000 letters to American families. These were letters that the families had written to their sons, to their husbands, to their brothers, not knowing yet that the soldier they were writing to was already dead. The envelopes came back, each one stamped in heavy purple ink with 3 words: deceased, undeliverable, returned. In thousands of American homes, in the summer and fall of 1944, the purple stamp arrived before the official War Department telegram. Mothers learned that their boys were dead from a returned letter in their own handwriting. A wife in Detroit recognized the handwriting on her envelope before she even saw the stamp. She was the only person in the world who knew that handwriting that well. She sat down on the front steps and read the address she herself had written. Sergeant Daniel O'Brien, Company K, APO, 230. She had written that address 50 times. This time, the envelope had come home. In Bedford, Virginia, a sister kept her own unopened letter addressed to her brother William in the top drawer of her dresser. Every Christmas until 1991, she took it out, held it for a few minutes, and put it back. She never opened it. She said once to her granddaughter, "If I open it, then he really is gone." She died in 1992. Her granddaughter found the letter, still sealed, still in its purple stamped envelope, in the top drawer of the dresser. It is in a museum in Roanoke now. It has still never been opened. There is a filing cabinet somewhere in a Maryland archive that for 29 years held a letter the U.S. Army did not want anyone to see. The letter was written by a paratrooper named Fred Lefty Vest of the 101st Airborne on the night of June 4th, 1944. His letter was, by the standards of military censorship, a disaster. He named the operation. He named the date. He named the drop zones. He told his mother, in plain English, that he was about to jump into occupied France in approximately 36 hours, and that he was terrified. The censor flagged the letter. It was sent up the chain. The chain decided that the letter was too operationally specific to release and too personally devastating to destroy. So they did the third thing that bureaucracies always do. They filed it. Fred Vest jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5th, 1944. He was killed before he reached the ground. His mother was never told that he had written a letter. She lived for another 22 years, never knowing that her son's last words to her were sitting in a filing cabinet outside Washington. She died in 1966. In 1973, in a routine declassification review, the letter was finally released. It was sent to Fred's surviving sister in Cumberland, Maryland. She opened it. The final line read, "If they read this before you do, Mom, please know I never lied to you about being scared. I was scared the whole time. I just didn't want to make you sad. I am sorry I lied. I love you." 11 years later, in June of 1984, Ronald Reagan stood on a cliff in Normandy called Point du Hoc, and he gave a speech that millions of Americans still remember. The boys of Point du Hoc. In that speech, he quoted from a letter written by the daughter of a U.S. Army Ranger named Peter Robert Zanata, who had sworn to his dying father that she would visit Point du Hoc on his behalf. What is less well known is what Reagan was reading in his hotel room in Normandy the night before that speech. He had personally requested from the National Archives additional D-Day letters. He sat up that night in the lamplight reading them. The letters survive at the Reagan Library today with the president's pencil marks in the margins. Sentences underlined. Notes scrawled in the side. Use this. Keep this. Strong. In one of those letters, written by a ranger who would die at the base of the cliff at Point du Hoc on the morning of June 6th, there is one sentence underlined 3 times. Tell them we knew. He didn't mean tell them that he knew the operation was dangerous. He meant tell the people back home, that he had known exactly what he was walking into, that nobody had tricked him, that nobody had lied to him about the cliffs. He had seen the briefing photographs. He had counted the German guns at the top. He went anyway. and he wanted his family to know that he had gone with his eyes open. Here is the part of this story that most Americans do not realize. It is not over. The archive is not closed. In the spring of 2014, in a small Massachusetts town called Pittsfield, a young couple was renovating an old house they had just bought. They were tearing up the baseboards in the upstairs bedroom. Tucked behind the baseboard against the inside of the wall, they found a single envelope. It was sealed. The handwriting was neat, careful. It was addressed to 2 words. To Mom. The letter was from Sergeant Albert Tominelli of the 1st Infantry Division. He was killed on Omaha Beach in the first wave on June 6, 1944. His mother had lived in that house. She had died in 1971. She had hidden the letter, sealed, behind a baseboard sometime in the late 1940s. We will never know for certain why. The likeliest reason is the simplest one. She could not bear to open it, but she could not bear to throw it away either. So she put in the wall, and she left it for someone someday to find. 5 years later, in the spring of 2019, a French farmer named Pierre Lemoyne was plowing a field outside the village of Vierville-sur-Mer. The field is roughly 400 meters from the high water mark of Omaha Beach. His plow caught on something hard. He climbed down from the tractor and dug it up by hand. It was a corroded American cigarette case. The brand name was no longer legible. Inside, folded into a small square, was a single piece of paper. The paper had been protected, more or less, by the metal case. About half of the words were still legible. The rest had been eaten by 75 years of damp earth. For words on that paper survived in full. Tell Catherine I waited. Nobody knows who Catherine was. Nobody knows what he was waiting for. The owner of the cigarette case has never been identified. The case is on display today, along with the letter, at the Overlord Museum in Colleville-sur-Mer. And then there's the discovery that came in the autumn of 2022. A woman in Davenport, Iowa, was cleaning out the attic of the farmhouse where her grandfather had lived. He had died in 1987. The attic had not been properly opened since the year of his death. In a corner, under an old wool blanket, she found a wooden footlocker she had never seen before. The latch was rusted shut. She broke it open with a screwdriver. Inside the footlocker were 11 sealed envelopes. Each one was a last letter written by a soldier of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division in the days before D-Day. 11 letters never mailed. Her grandfather, a quiet man who had farmed corn and never spoken about the war, not once, not even to his wife, had survived D-Day. He had brought the letters home with him in 1945. He had kept them for 42 years in a footlocker in his attic. He had never delivered them. He had never opened them. He had never told anyone they existed. His granddaughter is, today, working with the National World War II Museum to identify and contact the descendants of the 11 men whose letters her grandfather carried home. So far, 4 of the 11 families have been found. 4 envelopes have been delivered, 82 years late. 7 families are still being searched for. Somewhere in this country, somewhere in your state, somewhere in your county, there is almost certainly an attic. And in that attic, there is almost certainly a footlocker. And in that footlocker, there may be a letter. An unsent letter is not a failed letter. It is the most honest letter ever written. The man writing it believes, in his bones, that he may not survive long enough to walk it back from the mailbox. So he writes the things he would never write in any other letter. Not the polite things, not the cheerful things, the true things. Every one of those boys, Catholic, Jewish, black, white, Methodist, Marine, paratrooper, medic, German, American, 16 years old, 36 years old, lying about his age or counting down to his pension. Every one of them sat down in pencil and tried to say what mattered. And what mattered in almost every single letter was not country. It was not flag. It was not glory. It was one other person. A mother. A fiancée. A daughter 4 years old in Skaneateles, New York. A buddy from boot camp. A wife who knew their handwriting better than her own. That is the real story of D-Day. That is what the history books, with all their maps and casualty figures, never quite said. The beaches were the event. The letters were the truth. Most D-Day last letters in the same way. Not with God. Not with country. Not with grand farewells. 3 small phrases. Almost always one of these 3. Don't worry. I love you. See you soon. The first one was a kindness. The second one was the truth. The third one was the lie they told to protect the people they loved most. They knew, in those last hours in southern England, that they might not come home. They knew it sitting on the cot. They knew it on the landing craft. They knew it when the ramp dropped. They wrote "See you soon" anyway. If you have something in your attic, a shoebox, a footlocker, an envelope you have been afraid to open, open it. They wrote those letters for you. They wrote them 82 years ago by the light of a single bulb in a tent in southern England. They're still waiting. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe. We tell the stories the history books left out, the human ones, the quiet ones, the ones that still matter. Until next time, don't worry. I love you. See you soon.